The following is a Shaw Public Affairs presentation.
They misled people in the election campaign. They misled them before the election campaign. They misled them after the election campaign. And now they're misleading them again with a grab bag of numbers, a grab bag of gimmicks that may happen at some point in the future in order to convince them that the HST, which is bad for them, is good for them.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and tonight on the show, a man of many hats. British Columbia's Energy Minister, British Columbia's Housing Minister, British Columbia's House Leader for the government side, and a member of the re-election committee for the BC Liberal Party, Rich Coleman. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Glenn.
Did you get up in the morning and have trouble deciding what you're going to do today? You don't probably lack for a to-do list.
We add in a few committees, and there's really not a whole lot of time to think about what I'm going to do today. It's pretty well scheduled out. Yeah.
So if people are watching us live on Thursday night, you just wrapped up a short session of the legislature, the shortest session in a long, long time. The House only sat for about 24 days this year. How come?
Mm-hmm. Oh, a number of things. I mean, obviously, the whole dynamic around two leadership campaigns impacted all of this. We had the 4-day session in February to do the budget, present the budget by agreement. The houses broke because there were going to be leadership campaigns and votes. We, at that time, Mike Farnworth was the House Leader. We had walked through that. I was House Leader for those 4 days. And basically it was, okay, you've got a leadership campaign, you want time, so okay, 2 weeks ahead of your leadership campaign and 1 week on the other side. Ours is going to bump up to that, so we're going to have a situation, we're going to have this gap. They're going to have to, with a new leader, there'll be new cabinet, new government, basically no new executive councils. So that I knew that would take 2 to 3 weeks minimum to put together, because I never saw the former premier be able to do a cabinet in less than a month, because you take the time to decide who fits into what position and what that cabinet looks like. So coming into this session, I made it really clear as the House Leader. I sat down with their House Leader, John Horgan, and I said, John, we've got a certain amount of time. My objective is to get the estimates done. I believe we can do them in a number of hours we're going to give you. Because I looked at the previous hours that have been done on estimates, that would have been the low end of the numbers, but it still would have been 129 hours in that area. And I said, I've only got so many bills. And I was very open, probably more open than most House Leaders I've ever been. I actually told them what was coming, when it was coming, how it was coming, and thought we could get through most of it. We actually had 15 bills, but 3 of them were finance bills that are traditionally, because they're part of the budget, and so you're down to 12, and one of them was a miscellaneous statute bill I split in 2 because I wanted to get in the House early so they could get a start on it. And so it came down to about 11 bills. A normal session would be probably 35 or 40 bills, and so we did that, plus the estimates debate. We laid out the time. Then they asked if we could sit the week after the long weekend. I said fine. And then I offered them up again. I offered 2 other things, something they said they couldn't staff because they didn't have enough researchers. I said, well, we can run a third house. We could have actually opened another committee room and sped everything up even more so to get the work done. They didn't want to do that, but then they said they still needed more time, so I said, well, we'll sit to 9 o'clock the last 3 days, the 3 days of the last week, to give you additional time. So it actually, from the standpoint of the business, the important business was to get the budget passed, not to run government on interim supplier warrants. So that's the most important aspect of this session. We'll go this fall into a different session, election or no election, as the Premier says, and the reason being is, there are some longer bills that have been they've been out there for some sort of public consultation and that sort of thing, and agendas that are going to come through the process. So over the summer, the deputy ministers will identify the priorities in their ministries that they need done. We will then put them through the committees, to put them through the lens of the committees of which ones are going to have the priority, and then it would go into legislative drafting and be ready for a fall session. And so, it is a real anomaly year. There's no question, and it's all a result of the leadership changes in 2 parties at the same time. I don't know that this ever happened in such a short period of time that 2 parties have changed their leaders. The 2 main parties, in our case, the 2 parties in the legislature changed their leaders in that short a period of time. And so even during the period of time leading up to the leadership, it was interesting to be there, to be part of the transition going through as people left to go run for leadership, and you still had a government to run. So it's been an interesting cycle, but somewhat frustrating in some ways because, obviously you're used to a different cycle, and we'll get back on track.
You're saying you're getting ready for fall session. The other thing, your other hat there is chair of the re-election committee. You're probably having to get ready for a fall election as well, right?
Well, it's a possibility. It's not a definitive thing. The Premier's made it clear that she would like to get a mandate early rather than late. We do have a mandate, to 2013. So what we're doing now is getting all the ducks in order to be able to, if we needed to, go to an election if we wish to.
So money, organization, candidates nominated.
All of that, yeah.
And you got to be ready by sometime in August, right?
Yeah,
in case there's a fall.
We're giving ourselves an August deadline to be ready because if we went in the fall, it would have to be pre the municipal elections. So there's a limited window there. The Premier is not definitive about this at this point in time, so it's really about timing and whether we're ready and if the organization's ready to do it and how we get all that work done. So over the summer we'll be doing a lot of work to make sure we're ready, and then the opportunity comes that she wishes to go, she can go.
4-week campaign by law in British Columbia. If you're speculating, you want to bet, pick a date, mid to late September. Avoid the last week of September because the Union of BC Municipalities has their annual convention, and they enjoy going to the convention too much to disrupt it with an election. So that's my guess.
I don't know about that part.
Well, I don't know. You don't want to miss the UBCM. Lots to talk about tonight. We've got a lot of questions on tape about different things that are going to happen. But before we get to that, I just want to ask you about the working relationship with your opposite number in the House, John Horgan, because for a long time the British Columbia House was managed by what we call the two Mikes, Mike DeYoung and Mike Farnworth, and I think they got along pretty well. Some people in their own caucuses thought they got along too well, perhaps. But in any event, we got two people now, John Horgan on the NDP side, Rich Coleman on the government side, and both known to be a bit more scrappy. How have you been getting along?
Quite well, actually. I sat down right when John became the House Leader. I sat down with him and told him how I wanted to do things differently, and that was I would be very open. I would let him know ahead of time when legislation was coming. I told him there would be a trust of confidentiality here on certain things that were sensitive, but I would give him a schedule, and that would be updated daily and regularly, so he would have it every day. So my staff do that work. They meet with me, then they take it over to him to make sure he had copies of everything. And for the most part, I think it was a very respectful and worthwhile relationship for both of us.
Had a breakdown this morning, though, when your side wanted to appoint a new clerk of the legislature, and the NDP voted against it. We've never seen that happen before.
Yeah, I mean there was a bit of internal stuff on their side that I was told afterwards was going on. At the same time, when we first talked about it, they weren't fussed about it, and then they were fussed about it, and they weren't fussed about it, but.
That's bad.
That wasn't.
The clerk of the legislature is supposed to be nonpartisan.
Yeah.
And we've got, for the first time in 62 years, because the last three clerks have all been appointed unanimously, we've got Craig James as the clerk of the House, supported only by the government side.
Yeah, and I mean they said that in their short remarks today, they said he would probably be the leading candidate and that sort of thing, but it was a.
Process.
They had a different process they wanted. This one was the process by the Speaker. It's not that the House Leader walks in or the Premier walks in and says, "I'm doing something with the clerks." I mean, the Speaker of the House is in charge of that legislature. So he worked with George, the McMinn, who's the present clerk, who decided he wanted to move on, and they talked about the succession and went through it. They walked through the 2-year basically mentorship that George will stay for, because that's what George had as an advantage when he came here. Looked at other jurisdictions of the Commonwealth where the clerks are appointed by succession. He came to his decision, made his recommendation to the Premier and to the Leader of the Opposition. Met with both of them. I wasn't at the meetings, but that's what I understand. And then the motion is drafted and is presented by the government House Leader, because obviously that's where the motion comes from the clerk's office, because the Speaker doesn't put the motions in front of the House. And I thought it was an unfortunate moment, frankly, in my 15 years here today when they voted the way they did, because it wasn't necessary. They could have stated their case about they would have liked a different process, but not done the thing that would embarrass the one clerk that's being promoted who's sitting at the table, who didn't deserve that behavior today. And I've talked to them since, and I think a number of people on the other side of the house I spoke to through the day, were regretful, frankly, of how they handled that. But it's done.
Yeah. Probably the biggest bit of business done during the session, other than getting the budget approved, was the government's approval by motion of some changes in the harmonized sales tax. That motion went through the House on Monday and Tuesday of this week. So we're going to start off with a clip on that, comment on that, from a member of the Fight HST Alliance, Bill Tillman. Here's Bill.
Minister Coleman, the BC Liberal government has promised to reduce the HST, or harmonized sales tax rate, from 12% to 11% next year and down to 10% in 3 years. But when the Nova Scotia NDP government took power, having promised no tax increases, it actually raised the HST by 2%. What's to say that you won't have the same problem after an election, that you'll say we're out of money, we got to raise the HST, not lower it?
Well, the fact of the matter is we won't have to. Our projections are solid on this. I mean, I've been on Treasury Board over the years, I'm not now, but certainly sitting in Cabinet and going through the numbers when we were making this decision, looking at it, it was very clear that we could do this in our fiscal plan, that we could handle it, that we could manage the budget and be able to do this and reduce the HST. The whole objective here, I mean, it's one of those dichotomies we face. I mean, when we brought it in, as you know, we certainly didn't receive accolades for how we did it and all the rest of it with regards to the
Worst
HST.
handled public policy initiative I've seen in 27 years doing this job.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with you, and neither would actually most of the people that were involved. And as we came through this whole period, since then, and speaking to people, they say, why don't you tell us what it's about, and why does it have to be what it is, and why can't you, make it so at least we're kept whole as families? And so we decided when the new Premier came in, we said we knew we were going to move the date up, so let's go out and do some work here this time. I mean, if we're going to try it, to try and actually be successful with the referendum, let's go do some work. And so there's been a pretty extensive listening exercise going on with the Minister of Finance, but not just there, but also with the rest of us in our ridings and what have you. And I think the message has been pretty clear that people are starting to understand that this tax has some significant benefits for British Columbia, but they still were feeling that, maybe they were paying too much of it. So, we went out to an independent panel. They come back with some recommendations. They say it's affecting families by $350 a year. We say, okay, how can we make them whole over the next year? Give the children, give them something per child that will take care of the $350. And by that time, we're into reducing it by 1%, which we can't do until next year because of the agreement with the federal government. And we'll reduce it by the 1%. That'll bring it down, and that'll basically keep everybody whole. And by the time we get to 10%, everybody will be ahead. And we had to do something that, what people would say, but it's really against your sort of thinking, as how you've been as a government, because we're a tax cutter. And, we cut personal income tax by 38% over the last number of years. But in addition to that, we had brought, the corporate business tax rate down. We got rid of the corporate capital tax. We had, we had brought the small business tax down. And even my friends in the corporate community says, if you have to make this thing balance, you should raise this. Because we think it's more important for the long-term economic viability of the province, so we don't mind taking our piece too. So that's why we're raising the corporate tax up 2%, and the small business tax, which is at 2.5, we wanted to get it to 0. People also have to forget, there used to be a threshold of $200,000 or $300,000 that you can make before you're into certain tax levels, and now it's at $500,000. So small business, we're already well ahead with regards to taxation. So we made a decision to sort of balance it out. That's what we did.
The change in rates, my understanding is that the federal government will now implement. Now, the legislature's approved it in principle.
Yeah.
The HST is a federal tax. The federal government, now on direction from the province, will actually pass a cabinet order reducing those rates?
That's correct. What happened, I don't know if it's a cabinet order or whether it's something they do it there.
I gather it will happen before the people start voting on the referendum.
I don't know when it has to happen, to be honest with you, Vaughn. I just know that that the harmonized sales tax is now collected by the federal government in one tax form versus the two that you used to do for the PST and for the GST. And so they collect it, and then they send us our portion, of the tax. So we were at 7% going in. We'll take it down to 6 and then to 5 on our end. The GST is at 5% already, and so that's basically what'll happen. Yeah.
So, Minister of Energy as well, and House Leader, also Minister of Housing, and I thought, well, why don't we start off with a housing question? Here it is. Sean Holman.
Rich, I know you're a big proponent of the government's move to allow 6-story wood frame buildings. And as you know, I've been a big investigator of that initiative. And I've heard in that capacity a lot of concerns about that initiative, concerns that keep on coming up even now. Now, I'm just wondering, don't you think that it's time that there's a second look taken at this particular initiative, at least to calm the concerns of people who are still worried about it, especially given the fact that it appeared to have been rushed through?
And the first of them burned to the ground the other day, didn't it?
Actually, it didn't. It wasn't the first one.
Oh,
we already have some 6-story wood frame built in BC and operating. And I'll deal with that in a second. But Sean's been on this since the beginning, and we have quite a few chats in the hall whenever I'm there about this. And we're not going to go back and take a second look. We've done the work with all the engineering people. We did all this research. We did consultation with all the people, architects, engineers, municipalities. We know that we can build 6-story wood frame construction safely, and that it's safe buildings. And as a matter of fact, there's places in the world where they go even much more higher than that in places in particularly England and Europe. We're a wood-based economy. Unfortunately, we did have a 6-story building under construction that had a fire in Richmond, and everybody decided to point to that. Well, that fire was a disaster from the standpoint. Totally insured project, so it'll be built, but it's no different than 4-story construction or 3-story construction at that stage of construction. It's a very delicate time. You have the wood exposed. You don't have sprinkler systems on site. You could have heaters in there drying drywall or other things. This one appears to have been started by a heater or electrical situation on site. At that stage, it'll happen. It happened actually, unfortunately, to Mo Sahota when he was building his 4-story wood frame. I think it was a Sheridan Points West hotel or something out in Langford. And it burnt to the ground. They built it because it was insured, and this has nothing to do with the 6-story construction. It's a fire at that stage, any stage of that construction, at any building, is pretty much a tough thing for anyone to fight, simply because it's open, it's got air, and it's open, and it's wood, and it doesn't have the fire separations, the sprinkler systems, and whatever that we put in when as the building is finished. So we do have a 6-story finished in Kamloops, and we have others that are under construction, and really it's the right thing to do. We didn't rush it through. We did send our folks to do the right work, to do it right.
Rich Coleman had been BC's energy minister for about 48 hours, 72 hours, when he announced that Premier had asked him to take another look at some decisions at BC Hydro. Here, with a question on the state of British Columbia Hydro, Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Gregory Thomas.
How did the BC Liberals manage to pull $3 billion out of BC Hydro since taking power, load an additional $4 billion in debt on Hydro, and still need $6 billion more to replace the turbines at the Bennett Dam and keep its transformers in downtown Vancouver from blowing up and catching fire?
He's not impressed.
I've known Gregory a long time, so it's actually the first time he's ever asked me a question, but we go way back in politics when he was a young Tory, actually. And he actually does a pretty good job here for these guys. So
we use him a lot. Yeah, I agree. He asks good questions.
He's just we've just known each other a long time. So, and that's his style of questioning, by the way. So, even when you're just talking to him one-on-one. But
having said that, what's the answer?
Having said that is it wasn't quite 48 hours. I had enough time to go do a number of briefings with Hydro, and I had come to the conclusion. I talked to the Premier, and I said, this thing needs a look. The company has a diversified portfolio. What government does with it over the years, not just us, but successive governments, whether it be rate freezes at one point in time, or whether it be how we measure the water behind our dams, or how we price the water licensing, and how we actually calculate our dividends, which actually, all our crowns pay into general revenue. That's the whole idea of having a crown, so it can help you with your, with your whole aspect in and around, your healthcare, education, your other costs. But at the same time, I was concerned when I looked at hydro, and I'd had some sort of play with hydro over the years in other committees, and I always felt this was one that this corporation just wasn't right, sort of like listening to sort of some ideas. And so I was actually happy to get an opportunity to look at hydro. And, to Gregory's question, I mean, not all his numbers are accurate, but the government has taken dividends from hydro over the last number of years. That's because they're supposed to make money for us. They have had an increase in their debt, and that's because they have some pretty aging infrastructure. They have dams that have been built 60 years ago now. And these things, some of them have seismic issues, and they have old generators in them that actually we can't get parts for anymore, and we have to replace them. There's significant costs to them, and so I then spent some time on some of those projects with hydro, toured a couple of the dams, went through the challenges that we had, and found some pretty remarkable things that have been done down the beginning of the construction of these things, but now knowing seismic issues and stuff that we have to do. So we can get more power out of them by doing strategic investments, and the payback's not bad. So like the John Hart Dam on Vancouver is about 10 years payback if we make the $1.some billion investment.
I'm going to come back with more on hydro, but first we're going to take a brief break with Rich Coleman. Stay with us on Voice of BC.
People might be into shelters, but that doesn't actually solve the problem. Shelters are simply temporary solutions. It's not a permanent home. And the provincial government, what they need to do and what they have not done is to put forward a permanent, comprehensive housing strategy that builds new affordable housing across British Columbia.
Your source for in-depth, local political coverage. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
Crime happens, but where it happens and who becomes the victim can be influenced by you and your community. As the eyes and ears of their neighborhoods, Block Watch programs assist police by reporting suspicious activity.
I'm witnessing a theft from a vehicle.
To learn more about crime prevention in your neighborhood, contact your local police department or the Block Watch Society of BC.
If you would like to contact us at Voice of BC, write to us. Our mailing address is 111 1925 Blanchard Street, Victoria, BC, V8T 4J2, or send us an email to vobc@shaw.ca.
What's your thing? Bugs.
My thing's sound effects. Here's a T-Rex.
Mom! Mom! Aiden cut me in half again!
Nobody's good at everything, but everybody's good at something. What's your thing?
Your caucus colleague, Mr. Pym, recently suggested in the legislature that, in fact, only those people that live in the Peace River region really have any authority to speak on natural gas issues. I'm wondering if that's a sentiment that you share.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and Rich Coleman's going to ask the question you just saw from Ben Parfit.
Well, Pat's pretty passionate about Fort St. John and Fort Nelson, the area in his riding, and when he makes that, I think you always have to consider the context. He sees people who are critical about something that's supporting his area of the province, that brings significant revenue to the province, and people that are ill-informed making comments about it. And I think what he's getting at there is, look, get educated. I mean, we can make our decisions up here because we live here. We're making We work with it, we live with it, we understand it, we know the zoning, we know how the water is managed, we know all the things in and around natural gas that you're being critical of, and I don't think it was so much that nobody knows. It's just that he's very passionate and he's very good at explaining to people and taking the time for people to understand how important it is to his community. And so, you know, when you get in speeches in the legislature, you'll say something in a speech and it's part of the context, take a piece of it out and you can say, well, this is what the guy thinks. That's not just what he thinks.
Before the break, you were telling me about why you decided to review hydro, and I've heard some of the arguments on it in your debate in the House. I think everybody would accept the earthquake proofing is necessary. If the equipment is antiquated, it needs to be upgraded, that we obviously have to make some allowance for future power needs, and we ought to be conserving, and I recognize you're doing all that. There's one requirement placed on hydro that doesn't strike me as absolutely essential. It's there, and I understand the merits of it. And that's the requirement for energy self-sufficiency. And hydro people should know it isn't required to just be self-sufficient. It is required to be self-sufficient in energy in probably the worst case scenario. Low water in British Columbia, a year when our dams would not be providing us with any slack at all, and with a bonus on top of that of almost one entire hydroelectric dam of extra, just in case. Strikes me that that requirement is one of the things that's driving these big rate increases at hydro, and that requirement doesn't have to be there. You could have a less conservative, a less stringent requirement and take some of the pressure off hydro.
And Vaughn, that may be the case, and that's part of what the review is about. Because one of the things I said to the group that are going to do the review, it's just not about just the operations of hydro. It's what are the things that impact on hydro that other things do, like government. Like, is there anything we've done that really we should rethink? And I feel it's important.
I think that's probably number one on the list.
Yeah, and so they will come back with recommendations on it. I believe it's important that we don't be afraid of looking and doing a rethink on things sometimes, because it is really critical to reach the goal that the Premier has said, and that is, with the Family's First agenda is the rate to the family in British Columbia. We want to make sure that we can run a good corporation, we have a sustainable company, we take care of the issues that we have with having to do upgrades and what have you and new power. At the same time, do it in such a way that we're going to have the minimal impact on rates. And so if there are things, decisions that have been made that should be looked at and have a second look, they should during this review, and they will.
Future source of export revenue for British Columbia, perhaps. We need more money to pay for all these programs. Question on it, Jock Finlayson, here he is.
Minister, as you know, a lot of natural gas companies in Canada are looking at opportunities to develop new markets in Asia, particularly since the prices for natural gas in Asia are 2 or 3 times higher than those now prevailing in North America. Is the government supportive of exporting BC natural gas to Asia? And how big is the opportunity over the next 5 or 10 years to develop new markets in that part of the world?
Well, first of all, we're very enthusiastic about getting it to Asia. And it's a very big piece of the long-term plan for the Northwest part of the province and for everybody in British Columbia, because the price in Asia is about 3-4 times higher than the North American market. We are the furthest away from the market where our gas is. We have 100 years supply now of natural gas and finding more all the time. We've got 2 or 3 basins we haven't even got into yet where we know there's more. The Asian market wants liquefied natural gas, whether it be Korea or China or India, that whole Asian market and other markets around the world, and we have it. So we have
got to build a pipeline.
So we have one company in Canada that's working on a pipeline from the northeast part of the province to Kitimat to build an LNG plant. They have the agreement with about 16 of the 17 First Nations along the route. There is a First Nation involved as a partner in the LNG plant in Kitimat. It would probably be on First Nations land, and they would get both the job opportunities and tax revenue off that. It's a win-win for everybody if we can get it done, because now we have a market for our gas. Basically, it's a very marginal product right now. The rest of North America, because the price is so depressed. And we have other companies looking at trying to get into Rupert with a pipeline. The natural gas piece of this thing, this thing is worth billions to British Columbians in jobs, economic growth, and a large amount of money for the provincial treasury, which is going to help us, deal with the budget issues we're all going to face as we have an aging population. This is one of our golden opportunities, actually, and it's a significant one, and we'll be pursuing it aggressively with the investors and the companies.
I do a fair amount of commentary on American radio, and the other thing that strikes me about it is that the Americans every now and then decide they don't want Canadian oil, Canadian gas. They don't like the price. They don't like the pipelines. It'd be nice to have another customer, so that you can play one off against the other. Here's somebody we haven't heard from on the show for a while. We should get him on this fall. Head of the BC Federation of Labour, Jim Sinclair. Here's Jim.
Minister Coleman, we have 250,000 British Columbians who are unemployed today in this province. We also have a climate change crisis in British Columbia, which your government also acknowledges. What steps is the government taking immediately to put thousands of people back to work, creating a green, sustainable economy in this province?
Well, a lot of things, actually. I mean, we have a bioenergy plan we're working on aggressively, which would use the waste wood that won't go through the mills in BC for other purposes. We have a number of large pellet operations that are coming to British Columbia to use that as a fuel that they would take to Asia. We're always trying to find ways to create jobs and economic development, whether it's in mines or whether it's in natural gas or all of those things, and we need to work together as a province to be successful, and it just never stops. You literally have to pay a specific attention to the things that affect the economy, and that's really why the Premier has actually appointed a minister whose jobs and innovation in Pat Bell, because he's going to coordinate with the rest of us to make sure the investment is there. How do we attract the investment? How do we attract the jobs to BC?
Mines Ministry was in energy this time last year, then it got bounced out to forestry, natural resources, something or other, and then it was taken back, and it's now, you got it back again, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we got a question about mines. Bill Tillman.
Minister, Premier Christy Clark says the #1 priority for your government in dealing with the federal government is to have reversed the rejection of the Prosperity Mine in the Caribou, which was rejected because it would be environmentally devastating. How do you justify that sort of a change after the federal government under Stephen Harper said it was too environmentally damaging?
Well, there's a number of aspects here. First of all, I think before anything happens with Prosperity Mine, I think we have to build a strong relationship with the Silcotin, the First Nations. And I've had a number of meetings with them about their other issues up there, power. They have a mill that they'd like to have bioenergy with, and I'll be meeting with them tomorrow, actually, because I think we have some good news on some of those fronts for them. They are very passionate, some of them, some of their chiefs, about Fish Lake, and if you have to sit in a room and listen to that and understand it, and you have to build a relationship there. So I think that, quite frankly, the proponent here didn't do a great job of that, to be honest with you, and I think the sensitivity, I dealt with the Silcotin when I was a forest minister, and they're a very passionate, wonderful people, and they really believe in their area of the province, and they believe in their rights in that area of the province, and I actually agree with that with them. So on the Prosperity, the Premier had said she'd like to see Prosperity go ahead. However, it has to go back into an environmental process. The company has said that they're doing a new submission that they want to do, which would not include Fish Lake, and so I think we have to sort of wait and see what that looks like. But even having said that, and even if they go into that process, from my perspective, if they don't figure out how they're going to engage with the Silcotin in a respectful manner to get there, they still won't be successful. And I think that's the important part of this piece. So what I did when I became the minister is I made a point of saying I'm not going to put the Silcotin or anybody into a box where they're going to have to make decisions. I'm going to go build that relationship directly with the First Nation to build the trust so that someday we may be able to have a legitimate conversation about prosperity, but right now I'm not even having a conversation about prosperity. It's about the other issues that they face with power and bioenergy and their mill and the instability of lines in the area for them for their future anyway. And so at some point in time, the company will make their submission, and I've told them if they're making a submission, they need to provide in advance all the information they're going to send the federal government to the Silcotin, They are allowed to go and make an application for work because they have the mine permit piece. That has to go to consultation and accommodation, and that too should go to the Silcoteen in advance, so they have an opportunity to comment and raise their issues with regards to it. And so, from a provincial perspective, I believe someday we will get there, but we'll get there if we do it respectfully and understanding the wishes of the First Nation in the area.
If I were to divide the big resource developments in the province that are proceeding and that are fairly successful and the ones that aren't, I would say it's how good a relationship the developer and the provincial government has managed to make with First Nation. You're not going to get very far on Crown land, on traditional territory of native bands in this province, unless you have that relationship. We had former Premier Dan Miller on the show a while ago, and he talked about it. Here is Dan Miller.
There are circumstances where resource companies have not been very smart about what they should be doing. They don't know, quite frankly, some of them don't know how to make the approach and what are the important issues, et cetera, or the respect for culture and the rest of it. But there have been others who have made outstanding efforts to try to get an agreement and have been simply met with, "I'm sorry, we're not interested." And that, to me, is the more fundamental dilemma.
What do you do in those circumstances?
Well, I think you have to reach the level where you make your consultation accommodation at a level that'll stand a test at that point. You do run into this from time to time, but Dan's absolutely right. The companies that are smart and understand, these are the laws. The Supreme Court's ruled on a number of things in decisions that we as a province now have to abide by. In consultation, accommodation with First Nation, it's a moving target a little bit because, it changes depending on the deal or whatever. Resource revenue sharing, which we've started to do with First Nations, is important because it's respectful and understands their participation on the land base. And, this has been quite a learning curve for, I think, anybody that's been a minister or anybody that's been in government in BC as we build this. And, I find, like Dan said, there are companies that just still think everybody's just going to say welcome and go ahead, and don't understand that there's some sensitivities to what they want to do. The ones that do understand it and do engage and work hard at it are usually successful. And that's a message I try and give them. They say, well, we're worried about your First Nations thing when it comes to investment. I say, well, quit worrying about it. Figure it out. Invest some time and money with the First Nation and people that understand the relationship you need to build here, and you'll be successful.
Yeah, they're lovely people, and they're not going anywhere. And they've been here a while.
That's right.
Some of them longer than others. Everyone going around asking, how the heck did Hydro manage to talk a tough guy like Rich Coleman into supporting those smart meters so fast? Because it was almost that first couple of weeks. So here with a question on smart meters is Ben Parfit.
How we are going to tackle and address conservation. What mechanisms are best going to achieve that desired result? We need to lower our energy consumption, and in doing so, we're going to achieve a lot of benefits. So to me, that's the real issue. If at the end of the day meters do that, serve to do that, great. I think, however, simply sending a signal by way of price is far more likely to get consumers' attention and achieve the desired result.
You generated a lot of controversy by approving smart meters right away.
Yeah, well, they were in the Clean Energy Act, so this was a direction of government to BC Hydro, and when I became the minister, there had already been some $300 million invested in the program already. The meters, the contracts were let, meters were being bought, built, and what have you. I went and looked at the business case, and I'm a pretty pragmatic guy. When I come in, I ask you some pretty fundamental questions about it, and the challenge with the smart meters, and even I said to Hydro, I said, I don't understand why you do the messaging you do when this isn't just about a meter. It's about an entirely smart grid. We're making an investment in the grid. Yes, the smart meter at the end is part of it. You can, it sends us, it sends us information 4 times a day, so we can manage the system. It gives you an opportunity to have something in your home if you wished, where you can actually watch your, you can buy something to watch your power consumption, or go on your computer to check your power consumption. But that's at the end of the line. all the way down the line, you have opportunities where you lose power, you know, basically on transmission, or you have a transformer go down, or whatever the case may be, and you need a system that can talk to itself. And the other piece about it is that, you know, if you have a windstorm or something, you can actually send people with the right equipment to the right location to fix it, which is safer for your employees and safer for, and a better reaction to the problem.
Instead of sending a whole bunch of people out in trucks to figure out where the heck the line's down.
So and on top of that, then you say, what's the business case? So we've already saved $70 million in the early stages of the program. The budget is down by about $200 million because our buying is better, our procurement has improved, and that's one of the issues with hydro. There's a procurement issue in my mind that will be addressed in the review. But at the same time, you say, what's the business case? So there's a $500 million payback over 10 years, of the life of this thing, or 10 or 15 years, or whatever it is, and we get our money back. And I said, and then in addition to that, so there's the smart grid, down to a smart meter. It's a smarter system, and we should find some savings. And then you ask the next question. Can you buy the old meters anymore? The answer is no. We're going to have to change these eventually anyway. Some of the old mechanical meters will last another 10 or 20 years. Some will break down. But the reality is, you have to decide to modernize your system at some point. So that's what we're doing. And so when you look at the whole business case, and then you say, how much is it going to affect rates? And you're told that it's about a 2% reduction in rates once fully implemented, you say, well, all of this is starting to make some sense to me, right? The challenge is getting the message given so people understand it.
Yeah, and I think they've fallen down on that. We will take a brief break on Voice of BC with Rich Coleman. Stay with us.
I think we as the NDP believe that everybody has a right to safe, affordable housing, whereas I believe that the Liberals see it as a market opportunity and a market venture.
Producing over 9,000 hours of local programming every year, this is Shaw TV, your local voice.
As I'm driving to work, I can feel the anxiety building. My stomach starts to get sick. I start to sweat.
It's a feeling of terror, like a life and death situation, basically.
I always feel like I'm, under a spotlight.
I would kill myself at a certain point if things didn't get better.
Anxiety and depressive disorders are the most common of all mental illnesses. For a free mental health screening, call our toll-free number or visit our website today.
Missed something on Voice of BC? Catch an encore presentation of this show on your local Shaw TV. If you live in the Lower Mainland, Voice of BC rebroadcasts Saturday morning at 10:30 and Sunday afternoon at 4. On Vancouver Island, watch Voice of BC Saturday at 10 a.m. or Sunday afternoon at 2. To find out when Voice of BC rebroadcasts in all other parts of the province, please contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area.
Kidney disease affects an estimated 2 million Canadians. Many don't even know they have it. But thanks to the Kidney Foundation of Canada's innovative programs and vital research, countless people have been able to turn to us to help them manage, delay, and in some cases even prevent the disease. We're the Kidney Foundation of Canada. Please support us. We're behind you, all the way.
Everyone knows that Rich Coleman's a conservative sort of guy, small c, big C, but he's had to endure being called a BC Liberal for almost a dozen years or more. Now Colin Hanson comes along, the former finance minister, and says, let's change the name of the party. Christy Clark says, that has a lot of merit. The guy's just got used to being a BC Liberal, for goodness sakes.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and we'll get Rich Coleman's response to the change of name of the Liberal Party in a minute, but I just want to say that next week on the show we've got Rich Coleman's counterpart on the NDP side, John Horgan, and also Shane Simpson of the NDP to give their take on the recent session of the legislature, which wrapped up today. What do you think of this name change idea?
Well, I think, we've, over the years at different times, people have talked about it. I mean, the Premier is open to having a discussion at some point in time at a convention. This isn't something that we decide as a government or a caucus. It's something that the party would decide. I'm actually quite happy with the BC Liberal name. I mean, I like the logo. It's got blue and red in it. I'm okay with that. And
people don't hiss at you when you walk down the street in Langley?
No, absolutely not, actually. I mean, I get close to 70% of the vote, or in the mid-60s of the vote every time. So, I mean, I became a BC Liberal back in 1995 when I met Gordon Campbell. I joined the party. I'd been a SOCRED for a long time, and a federal Conservative. And
the Conservatives get about 70% of the vote federally in your riding.
Yes, they do. Yeah. Reform before that, and then Conservative before that is pretty much...
Voters kind of figure this stuff out, actually.
Yeah, they actually do. And I, so I've been 15 years under the label, so it's not like I just got used to it. But I think that, if at some point in time the party wanted to have that discussion, then fine, have that discussion. But I also think it's a brand that has some merit still.
He's got a whole warehouse full of mugs, BC Liberal T-shirts, scarves, hats. He doesn't want to have to get rid of all that. So he doesn't want a name change. Okay. Question from Dan Miller about run-of-the-river power. Here he is.
I like the idea of IPPs, but I didn't like what subsequently happened, which was the government put the handcuffs on BC Hydro. What they said was any new energy will now come from independent sources. And I say that because I don't think you can take a large entity like Hydro. It's a company. It's a Crown Corporation, but it's a company. I don't think you can say, okay, you will never grow, that you will never do anything else again. I think it stagnates. It starts to deteriorate from within. If you're in the energy development business, you should be in the energy development business, and Hydro should be out there competing along with everybody else.
Got a point?
In some ways, he does. I think part of the misunderstanding, though, is we don't send Hydro out to take certain risks. I mean, when it comes to wind power or solar, these guys, people that want to come in, have to bid in and come in with their projects. If we want to buy the power, we need it for capacity, and it's at the price that makes sense. And Hydro should be in that business as well. There was a thought that Hydro should be, in the export business as well. But of course, the price of power has dropped dramatically, and the export price isn't there today, where you could build an export argument. But down the road, that may come back, and so that's why you want to have. We told them to become, self-sufficient, and one of the ways they can do that is by buying power. Other ways is by a thing like Site C Dam and that sort of things. I think,
Where does Site C stand?
Well, Site C stands right now that it's going into the environmental review process.
That's about a 2-year.
Yeah, and it's into the consultation phase. We've identified the price, $7.9 billion is the price of the dam, or is it, $7.9 billion, and we've redesigned it to meet more modern dam design, because it basically means we use less water behind the dam, more of a large run-of-river project, and we'll get more out of it. There's always thought to be 900 megawatt property. It's going to be 1,100 megawatt. It's an important piece of the planning for power in BC, because it's not just about, it's about, first of all, taking care of future needs, but we have a huge challenge as we build into the northeast part of the province and into the northwest with mines and with the natural gas that needs to be electrified at some point. So we're going to be pushing power not always south but also north, because we're going to need power up there.
Wouldn't be a BC project to build something if you didn't have a protest. You already got protests on this thing. Another 10 years if it ever does get built, right?
I think it'll be less than that, but I don't think dramatically less than that. I mean, I think if you get through the environmental process, and of course we have the community and the First Nations piece that we're going to work aggressively on. There's a pretty good team over there leading that project, and I was pretty impressed with how they had fixed their numbers and done their work and done their international review of dams. And I think that it's a good project. It's a huge economic driver when you invest that much money. It's strong for the future for BC, and most people believe it's something that we should be doing.
You won't get it done without First Nations approval, though. You need that, right?
You always have to have First Nations consultation and accommodation on these things, and we will work very hard with the First Nations and the affected communities up there.
Yeah. Well, we got a little bit of time left, and I did mention that he's Minister of Housing as well, along with everything else. So we've got a couple of comments and questions on housing. First of all, Gregory Thomas again with another one of those drill right into your skull questions. Here's Gregory.
The BC government spends hundreds of millions of dollars on the downtown east side, and you recently bought and refurbished scores of hotel rooms. for the homeless at massive cost to the taxpayer. Yet Vancouver City Council pretends it's their idea and takes all the credit. The welfare lobby screams for more, and homeless people continue to flood into Vancouver from Atlantic Canada and the north. Is all this really worth it?
He doesn't very often sit on the fence, does he?
No, he doesn't, but he's got it wrong. Actually, homelessness is down in Vancouver. Street homelessness is down by almost 87%. This is working, this is where Gregory and I probably part ways, because I believe that we're there for all of society and for government, and the cost of somebody being homeless is actually a higher cost than actually having them houses stabilized. If you can get them into housing, you can take care of their mental health addictions, you can stabilize them with their medical needs, you can give them a more stable life and turn their lives around. And that's the objective here. When I did the housing strategy in 2006, I knew it was going to take time. I knew that we had to buy some stuff and renovate it, and everybody focuses downtown East Side when they talk about this issue. I don't. Well, it's a provincial focus for me. So we have done things in Victoria, Nanaimo, Campbell River, Kelowna, Penticton, Quesnel, Prince George. I had an officer tell me in Prince George that after we opened the shelter and the supportive housing in downtown Prince George, their calls in downtown Prince George dropped by 70%. So it's not just about the downtown East Side, and it's not a flood from Atlantic Canada. For the first time in any memory, Vancouver is the first North American city in any memory. The homelessness has gone down in a count from 3 years ago to today. In the Fraser Valley, the count was down by 50%. And this is starting to work. Now, street homelessness means you got people in shelters. So that's why we're building to transition them. We have 500 and some odd units coming on in Vancouver alone this year, which will be supportive housing units for folks so they can not be in shelters. They can transition from shelters to stable housing. And, we really do have to remember all the attendant costs in and around homelessness. It's the emergency rooms that get calls, it's the police that gets calls, it's the social worker that has to hit the street, it's all the other support workers. If you can stabilize that population, all of that allows us to expand those services to other places where they're needed. And that's the whole objective. And it's actually one of the files I'm most proud of as a minister, because I think we're actually getting somewhere.
Quite a while too.
Yeah.
I mean, you've over 2 premiers. So the Gregory Thomas question was the question from the right, and here with the question from the left is Jenny Kwan.
In any day, any night, you can walk through our community and you'll see people who are homeless on the streets. And it is true, the City of Vancouver has done a lot of work under Mayor Gregory Robertson in trying to address the street homelessness issue. But the reality remains is that we have a homelessness crisis. People might be into shelters, but that doesn't actually solve the problem. Shelters are simply temporary solutions. It's not a permanent home.
Well, Jenny, it's an interesting thing with Jenny, but she just mentioned this. It's the Vancouver city that's done something in Vancouver. It's all provincial money. The reality is they provided some buildings for free rent, and we did the rest, right? And we're the ones that put the outreach workers on the street to connect people to the shelters, to homeless, to housing, to health support. And and I don't worry about that, because I don't think it's a matter of who's getting the credit. It's a matter of whether you're getting the results. Jenny, seldom ever gives credit. So she wrote me a letter once.
She's a member of the opposition.
Yeah, she wrote me a letter once asking me to save the Carl rooms, which was one SRO in the downtown East Side. 2 weeks later, I announced we'd bought 10 of them, including the Carl rooms. She could not bring herself to say that was a good thing. That's just the way it is, and yet her riding has had more benefit from the housing strategy in BC than any other riding in the province, because part of her riding is in downtown East Side.
Seth Klein, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, rental assistance. Here's Seth.
Do you have concerns that in communities with very low vacancy rates, many of the benefits of the rental assistance program are simply flowing to landlords in the form of increased rents?
No, I don't. And that's just a nonsense argument that's always made by the left. The rental assistance program is, today, there's about almost 10,000 families that receive a check quietly, an average of about $360 a month. Anywhere in the province they live in rental housing, so they could have affordability in housing. If we tried to build that housing over the last 5 years that we have had this program in place, it would have cost us over $3 billion, and we wouldn't have it built yet. Because quite frankly, we'd be going through rezoning, we'd be having public hearings where people don't want this type of housing in their neighborhood. all of these things. So what we've done with rent assistance is to a family under $35,000 in income, they can get rent assistance wherever they are in the community and find the housing they need and be integrated into the community, which I think is really, really important. It doesn't stigmatize or ghettoize people, and they can get on with their lives. And the reality is, it doesn't affect what the landlord's charging, because there's already rent controls in BC, 2% plus CPI, an annual increase, and the landlord doesn't know who's getting it because it goes directly to the individual family. And it's not like we walk in and say, here, this is the rent assistance plan. They don't know. We don't disclose that. So that argument is just spurious for me.
From the Tyee, Andrew McLeod, colleague of mine in the press gallery. Question for Minister Coleman. Here's Andrew.
Minister Coleman, the province has aggressive goals to cut carbon emissions and has taken steps such as the carbon tax to do that. At the same time, we've been aggressively promoting coal mining and oil and gas exploration and development, and I'm wondering how you reconcile those two things.
Well, there's a balance that gets struck. I mean, the coal we mine obviously creates jobs, and it goes by train and then overseas to, our metallurgical coal goes to a lot of places like Japan to make steel and that sort of stuff. We try to work with our industries. That's always been the plan, our major industries, to try and reduce their emissions. So in the oil and gas sector, there's some projects being looked at to sequester some of the CO2 that's there. There's other things they're looking at to how they can electrify to reduce their CO2 if they're having to use some of their gas at the well site for CO2 emissions and those sort of things. So, and you have to remember that if you could take natural gas and put it into major fleets, what it does to lowering the GHGs that come out of the fleets, and that's an initiative we're working on with industry. So fleets that come home to base particularly can have, fill up natural gas at night and run on those versus diesel or other gasolines. And I think it's just a balance you strike. I mean, we have a responsibility to the environment. We have a responsibility to the climate of the world. At the same time, to strike a balance. And I think we're trying to be leaders. At the same time, bringing an advantage by actually having our industries looked at as being greener and more sustainable.
Time for one quick question left. George Heyman, Mineral Tenure Act. Here's George.
Mr. Coleman, BC's Mineral Tenure Act is over 100 years old. Recently, Alberta and Ontario have updated their Mineral Tenure Act. Our act gives precedence over anyone who stakes a mining claim over any community plan, any other resource use, or any recreational use. Would you support changing BC's Mineral Act to ensure that mining is on a level playing field with all other proposed industrial and community uses?
This up for the fall session?
It's actually been raised to me since I became the minister. We'll look at it over the summer as part of our processes. It is an older act in BC. We have a number of old acts that we have to look at, and some of the engineers and geoscientists have also asked for some look at these sort of things. So wherever they're in a ministry, they will go into the hopper for priority. The deputy ministers will meet. They'll start to set the priorities around legislation, and then the minister makes the case to the committee if it's an issue they want, and then they try and get into the legislative cycle. There's a limited amount of drafting time and size of bills and what have you that can be done for any particular session. So I always look at it, the legislation is probably 18 months to 2 years. Regulation you could probably do in 90 days. And if it's a policy change, the minister can make it almost immediately. And I always like policy because we can get more things done that way.
When do you make up your mind on whether you're going to run again if there's an election?
Oh, I'll make it up. As far as it is right now, I'll be running in the next election, and I don't think any changes.
So don't waste your time running against him in his riding for the Liberal nomination. Thanks for being on the show tonight, Rich Coleman. Appreciate you having you on. Yeah. Next week on Voice of BC, John Horgan and Shane Simpson of the NDP. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature and BC politics into your living room. Good night.